A Koch-owned chemical plant in Texas broke the law for years. It ran away from the Clean Air Act until it just couldn't run anymore. Hello, my friends. Welcome to the channel. I'm the Electric Viking. Thank you for tuning in. It's great to see you. Navina Sadasivam and Clayton Aldern reported for Grist, in collaboration with the Houston Chronicle, that Michael Holtham, Oxbow's plant manager, had been preparing for this moment for a long time. He had been on the job for nearly a decade. His three brothers had worked at the Port Arthur plant, as had his dad. He loved coordinating his 60-person team and had enjoyed watching many of them grow in their jobs. But they were now facing a brand new challenge. The Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, or TCEQ, had installed an air monitor near the plant a few months earlier and was allowing Oxbow to capture nearly real-time data. The data was technically available to the public on request. Well, sort of. But Oxbow was the only company in the state to have sought it, and it used the information to its advantage. Every time the wind blew in the direction of the monitor and the readings ticked upward, Holtham and other Oxbow employees were alerted. Then they improvised ways to decrease the brownish-yellow sulfurous plume from spilling out of the smokestacks, stopping the company from running afoul of the law. They were still polluting the same, but they were being creative about how to hide it. The Port Arthur plant was built in the 1930s, and it's been grandfathered in as an exception to the landmark federal environmental laws of the 1970s. The old and decaying facility has 4 cavernous cylindrical kilns that are constantly rotating about half the length of a football field each. Raw pet coke, the bottom of the barrel remainder from retiring crude oil, is fed into the kilns and heated to temperatures as high as 2,400 degrees Fahrenheit, a fourth of the temperature of the surface of the sun. A fourth of the temperature of the surface of the sun. The intense heat helps burn off heavy metals, sulfur, and other impurities into the air. It emits more than double the amount of sulfur dioxide, which can cause wheezing and asthma attacks, than the average US coal-fired power plant. Holtham struggled to find the best way to stop setting off the monitor that January day. At 2 p.m., 12 hours into the ordeal, he increased the air being forced through one of the kilns in hopes of dispersing the emissions. When that didn't sufficiently decrease the sulfur dioxide readings, he contemplated shutting down one of the 4 kilns. At 5 p.m., he finally turned one of them off. But the damage was already done. A year later, when the data from the monitor was reviewed and certified, TCEQ staff would see that the facility had clearly exceeded the federal 1-hour standard for sulfur dioxide by nearly 20%. The emissions were so high that they set off a monitor more than 2 miles away. An air monitor gathers data near the Oxbow facility in Port Arthur, Texas, and its readings had been growing ever more alarming. Such exceedances are bound to have an effect on human health. Studies have shown that even short-term exposure to sulfur dioxide can increase the risk of stroke, asthma, and hospitalization. Multi-city studies in China have found that a roughly 4 ppb increase in sulfur dioxide levels is correlated with a 1 to 2% increase in strokes, pulmonary diseases, and even death. The asthma rate in the residential neighborhood surrounding the plant, West Port Arthur, which is more than 90% black, is 70% higher than the national average. And black residents in Jefferson County, where Oxbow is located, are 15% more likely to develop cancer and 40% more likely to die from it compared to the average Texan. Oxbow emissions regularly spiked above federal standards, hitting percentages as high as 62% above in 2017 and 2018. In 2017 and the first half of 18, Oxbow's emissions spiked to 47 ppb, 62% higher than the limit. And all through that time, Holtham and his colleagues continued to improvise. They turned down fans that spewed the emissions into the air, increased the amount of air forced through the kilns, and even tried a chemical treatment. They regularly turned off certain kilns when the sulfur readings at the monitor got too high. Oxbow has argued that these operational changes were experiments that the company conducted to try to bring the plant into compliance. The goal, Oxbow lawyers have said, was to identify a set of operational conditions that could keep them in the good graces of regulators. However, Oxbow acknowledges in court records that these experiments were conducted for at least a year, but a grist analysis of 2.5 years of internal operational data shows that, for at least another year, Oxbow's kiln modifications continued, and occurred primarily when the wind blew in the direction of the air monitor, a likely violation of the Clean Air Act. Really not all that dissimilar to what Volkswagen and other car companies did with their Dieselgate scandals. Now, I should mention Toyota as well, because they're in court right now for their own diesel scandal, tricking emissions tests. A little bit like what this coal plant had been doing for decades. Evidence now shows that high winds in the direction of the air monitor predicted decisions to shut down kilns, which reliably led to the monitor registering lower sulfur dioxide levels than what were actually being released into the atmosphere. About 40% of the time, at least one of a subset of kilns was shut down when the wind was blowing to the north. But the thing is, the same amount of emissions were being released regardless of the direction that the wind was blowing in. So the company was simply trying to game the system by turning off a kiln when the wind was blowing in the way that was pointed towards the air testing system. However, when the wind was not blowing, Oxbow's pollutants toward the monitor throughout this 1 year period that the facility did not alter its operations were exactly the same. In fact, they increased. By ensuring that the monitor was incapable of recording a comprehensive, untampered view of the facility's emissions, experts say Oxbow flaunted environmental law, in essence by guaranteeing that any air violations would not be detected, and continued to deteriorate air quality in the area. This is clearly a criminal violation of the Clean Air Act, said Joel Mintz, an emeritus professor of law at Nova Southeastern University in Florida, and former enforcement attorney with the Environmental Protection Agency. Mintz reviewed Grist's findings and said that Oxbow's actions are fairly egregious, violations of the law. He added that the EPA should open an investigation within the Justice Department pursuing criminal action. From August 2018 to July 2019, wind at the Port Arthur Oxbow facility blew from a variety of directions, but winds blowing from the south to the north was slightly more prevalent. An air monitor north of the Oxbow facility, which helps measure sulfur dioxide emissions from the plant, is in the path of these south to north coastal winds. Compared to normal conditions, however, when kilns were shut down during this period in Port Arthur, a more extreme bias emerged in the wind roses. Kilns 2, 3, and 5 at the plant were more likely to be shut down when the wind was blowing from south to north. And there was also a difference when it came to wind speed. The wider, darker bands in the wind roses indicated an increased frequency of higher speed winds. Compared to instances in which all kilns were on, these kilns were more likely to be off during higher southerly winds. According to the latest public data, Oxbow still emits more sulfur dioxide than any facility in Texas, aside from 5 coal and gas-fired power plants. One simple but pricey solution is to install sulfur dioxide scrubbers, which run emissions through a slurry of chemicals to mitigate their toxicity. But for at least 3 decades, in 4 different states, Oxbow has been trying to outrun environmental regulations that might require this expensive, profit-impacting step. Oxbow has been trying to outrun environmental regulations that might require this for years. And Oxbow's creative use of real-time official regulatory data has not only helped it stay in business, it's also helped the company rake in an estimated $80 million in sales a year. The costs of continuing to pollute are felt more acutely by those who live near the plant. The 3 plants Oxbow currently operates in Texas, Louisiana, and Oklahoma are the largest sulfur dioxide polluters in their respective countries, which combined are home to more than 760,000 people, and taken together emit more than 38,000 tons of sulfur dioxide every year. You got to force air in because it feels like my lungs are closing up. You never get used to it, said Ronald Wayne, a 65-year-old resident of West Port Arthur. In 2021, environmental groups and a legal firm filed a civil rights complaint against TCEQ, asking the EPA to investigate Oxbow's use of dispersion techniques, including the monitor alert system it set up. The groups also modeled sulfur dioxide concentrations based on Oxbow's maximum permitted emissions. The model found the maximum concentration around the facility would have been 8 times as high as the 75 ppb threshold. 8 times as high. That is dangerously high. The modeling results demonstrate that Oxbow is most certainly emitting sulfur dioxide in amounts greater than its permit, said the claim. Without intervention from the EPA, the lax regulation of Oxbow's operations will simply continue. They've been causing air quality conditions that we know now are harmful to human health since this began operating many decades ago, said Colin Cox, an attorney with the non-profit Environmental Integrity Project, one of the groups that filed the complaint. Jason Boone, 28, a native of Port Arthur, lies about 2 miles from the Oxbow plant. People feel like they're getting sick or their chest is cloudy, he said. Brad Goldstein, a spokesperson for Oxbow, called Grist's review of the company's data flawed and said that the findings are reckless and unsustainable. He added that the company is proud of its compliance record, emphasising that the sulfur dioxide readings at the monitors in Port Arthur are consistently below federal standards. Yeah, I wonder why that is. Oxbow values its reputation as a responsible corporate citizen and will vigorously defend it, he said. Holtham, the plant manager, declined multiple interview requests, unsurprisingly. For people like Ronald Wayne, a 65-year-old former resident of West Port Arthur, the combined emissions from Oxbow and the town's other industries have meant never getting used to the stench of sulfur, a rotten egg smell that just stinks. He's woken up to find his car coated in a layer of thin yellow and black dust and was forced to change the ruined air filters on his air conditioner 3 or 4 times every single month. Worst of all, he's become accustomed to waking up in the middle of the night gasping for air. You got to force air in because it feels like my lungs are closing up, he said. You never, ever get used to it. And then again, there's nothing you can do about it. The rules that Oxbow is required to follow are due to the fact that sulfur dioxide is one of 6 criteria air pollutants issued by the Clean Air Act, which requires the EPA to periodically assess them and set safe levels for their concentration in the air. There's no question that the act has resulted in tremendous gains in cleaning up the nation's air. Sulfur dioxide nationwide has decreased by 92% since the 1990s, and the days of acid rain seem to be well behind us. But in recent years, progress on improving air quality has stalled, if not reversed. Americans experienced more days of very unhealthy and hazardous air between 2018 and 2021 than any time in the last 2 decades. One reason for the hindered progress is the carve-out that the Clean Air Act of 1970 provided for polluting facilities that were already in operation when it was enacted, including at least 2 Oxbow facilities. In order to make the legislation politically palatable at the time, these facilities were grandfathered in and were able to retain their original emissions limits as long as they didn't significantly modify their operations. The provision provided a perverse incentive to keep old and dirty plants in operation and delay upgrading them, just for the sake of corporate profits. Grandfather facilities also benefit from another facet of the Clean Air Act, its prioritization of the concentration of pollutants as opposed to volume. Since the Act requires counties to meet specific air quality concentration thresholds, dilution is often the preferred solution, rather than actually reducing the raw volume of pollutants that emerge from industrial processes. Some of these dispersion methods, such as increasing black heights to legal limits or slowing the rate of emissions, are widely employed and legally permissible. Others, such as changing operations depending on climatic conditions, could be considered illegal. I think it's clear they are undoubtedly illegal. By its own admissions in court, Oxbow said 75 experiments from January 2017 through to June 2018 in order to see how various operating procedures would affect the dispersion of the plumes. They continued to experiment for a very long period of time on how best to trick the system into believing they weren't breaking the rules, when in fact they were, every single day. The dispersion protocol that the modeler and others developed involved changing the amount of air fed through the kilns, the amount of coke being processed, and operating temperature depending on the primary atmospheric condition and wind direction. These operational changes violate the Clean Air Act under two separate provisions. One section prohibits dispersion techniques that include any intermittent or supplemental control of air pollutants varying with atmospheric conditions. Another clause lists penalties, including up to 2 years in prison, for any person who knowingly falsifies, tampers with, and renders inaccurate or fails to reveal any monitoring device or method required to be maintained or followed. Mintz, the former EPA enforcement official, said that Oxbow's activities appeared to be in violation of these provisions. They have knowingly rendered inaccurate their device, said Mintz. If they had some sort of permission from the government to experiment as they did, that might be a defense, but they did not. Bill Koch is the lowest profile of the famously wealthy Koch brothers. Known for their outsized role in Republican politics and helping out government action on climate change, the Kochs have collectively given millions to conservative causes. But Bill Koch's most public endeavours thus far have been his vendettas against those who have sold him counterfeit wine. He claims to have spent $35 million tracking down counterfeiters, including when a con man sold him 4 bottles allegedly owned by Thomas Jefferson for over $400,000. When he's not chasing after con artists, Koch runs Oxbow's industrial empire, which operates a coal mine in Colorado and coke plants in Argentina, Texas, Louisiana, and Oklahoma. New environmental regulations have periodically led Oxbow to consider installing sulfur dioxide scrubbers at the coke plants, but for decades it found ways to get around it, to bend the rules. In 2010, however, the EPA dropped a bombshell by lowering the limit for ambient sulfur dioxide concentration from 140 ppb, averaged over a 24-hour period, to 75, averaged over 1 hour. The rule withstood multiple legal challenges from industry, required that states drew up a list of the top sulfur dioxide emitters and required them to prove their emissions would stay within the new limits. At the time states began to implement the EPA's plan, Oxbow operated in Illinois, Texas, Louisiana, and Oklahoma. In all 4 states, the company was shortlisted as a major sulfur dioxide polluter. Oxbow's plant in Lamont, Illinois, had already been the target of multiple EPA inspections and enforcement actions. It emitted as much as 7,000 tons of toxic sulfur dioxide a year and was using an expired permit that appeared to cap emissions at half that. A monitor about 2 miles away was recording readings close to or above 100 ppb, which put it in the EPA's and states' crosshairs when the new sulfur dioxide rules took effect. And that was in spite of the company gaming the emissions numbers using a wide variety of tricky techniques. Oxbow had considered scrubbers but found they would cost north of $50 million. Not in the cards economically, an executive would later recall. Given that it had about 50% extra capacity as the other plants, Oxbow shuttered the Lamont plant late that year and spread its operations among the 3 other locations. Unwilling to put scrubbers in other facilities either, citing costs, Oxbow attempted to prove through its own modelling that his plants could stay below the new 75 ppb standard. It's unclear what the company's internal modelling found, but Oxbow abandoned the effort in 2018 and elected to have state agencies place monitors near its plants instead. As David Rosenthal said, the former plant manager of Oxbow's facility in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, later put it, executives believed that air models tended to overestimate emissions, and monitoring with real data would be more reliable. Modelling is the cheaper option for both Oxbow and the state agencies. Monitors cost hundreds of thousands of dollars each to purchase, install, and operate. Oxbow bore some of those costs. The EPA must collect 3 years of data to determine compliance, meaning monitors brought the company at least 3 more years to comply with the rule. It was a common strategy. Of the 25 Texas facilities that were at risk of violating safer standards, more than half elected to show compliance through monitoring data. As the state agencies in Texas, Louisiana, and Oklahoma purchased the monitors and decided where to install them, Oxbow set up a task force that came up with sophisticated software to track the monitors' readings. Although the monitors were continuously recording sulfur dioxide readings every minute, the state environmental agencies at the time were only posting 1-hour averages on the website. Oxbow wanted close to real-time data and negotiated access to directly downloading readings at 5-minute intervals from the monitors. It could take up to 30 minutes before the readings reached Oxbow servers, but it provided enough of a lead time for plant managers to track when sulfur dioxide levels were ticking up dangerously high. Oxbow employees then gathered meteorological data, specifically wind direction and wind speed, and added it to the software that was recording the monitor readings. A number of plant managers, environmental engineers, and executives were given access to the data, and the software sent them emails when the wind was blowing in a 30-degree band over the monitor and recorded levels above a set healthy threshold. The company replicated the system for its facilities in Louisiana and Oklahoma, similarly negotiating access for 5-minute data from the respective state environmental agencies. Now, what does the state agency get out of this? Kickbacks? Bribes? I don't know. You tell me. What do you think? The fact that employees had spent months setting up this software was no secret. A senior Oxbow employee provided updates to Bill Koch himself. A December 2017 memo to Koch made public in-court findings noted that employees were running dispersion testing under various pre-selected scenarios for each facility when conditions warrant. So it would depend on which way the wind was blowing on how they decided they needed to actually game the system in that particular hour. Control room operators started noticing changes too. Once the monitors were installed, Milton Fuston, who was the main operator at the plant in Oklahoma, said that he received calls from a supervising engineer telling him to reduce the amount of coke being fed through the plant or to make other operational changes to reduce emissions. Some of those calls came during the night shifts, he said, when the engineer wasn't at the plant. It led Fuston, who worked at the plant for more than a decade before leaving in 2019 when the long and taxing shifts began taking a toll on his body, to believe that the monitor readings were driving the changes. In the beginning, every one of my nights I'd get a call to shut it down, Fuston told Grist, though he added that he wasn't directly told about a strategy to avoid pinging the monitor, but it was made fairly clear. Some days we go 3 days of shutting it down. Other days we let it spin. Shut it down, let it spin. Shut it down, and shut it down again. Cork Paul, who worked as a production supervisor at the Baton Rouge plant, recalled having to field complaints about the dust coming from the plant constantly. Chad Sears, who worked on the Oklahoma plant, said the emissions were so thick that a public pool nearby was usually covered in a layer of dust. Oxbow, he said, was paying for pool cleanup as a result. When you're on the highway, driving there in the summer, there's so much dust and smoke in the air, it looks like the whole place is on fire, Sears said. It's like a black, toxic hole. The clearest picture of Oxbow's operations emerges in Port Arthur, where the company was sold by a contractor. Since the superheated coke has to be cooled down before it can be shipped off to customers, Port Arthur Steam Energy, or PASE, saw a business opportunity to capture the excess heat, use it to generate steam, and sell the steam to a nearby Valero refinery. A portion of the profits was to be shared with Oxbow. For many years, it seemed like it was a win-win deal. Perhaps an efficient and even a green one, since it used energy that would otherwise have gone to waste. But the contractual relationship between Oxbow and PASE soured in 2017 after TCEQ installed the monitor. Oxbow claimed PASE's operations were to blame for the Port Arthur plant's high sulfur dioxide readings. The company said that when PASE captured the stream of hot gases as the coke was being processed and cooled it down, the emissions were released from its smokestacks at lower temperatures. As a result, the emissions were less likely to disperse into the air and more likely to be picked up by the monitor for exceeding limits. Oxbow ended its contract with PG&E in June 2018, as a result effectively running PASE out of business. They just killed the green air process. Ray Dio, one of the co-founders of PASC, told Public Health Watch and the Investigative Reporting Workshop, just because Bill Koch didn't want to go sell one Picasso or one of his Billy the Kid statues or whatever to pay for the scrubbers in Port Arthur, we all had to suffer as a result. PASE initially won in a Jefferson County court, but lost the appeal. The companies then proceeded to arbitration, where a panel of former judges ruled in Oxbow's favour, ordering PASC to pay administrative fees of $500,000 plus interest. When PASC appealed the judgment in a Harris County District Court, it lost. While these proceedings bankrupted PASC, the litigation provides an incredibly detailed window into Oxbow's operations. The discovery process and depositions led to Oxbow handling over thousands of pages of internal documents. Key among them is a spreadsheet of the 5-minute data that Oxbow collected from TCEQ's monitors, alongside information about whether each of its 4 kilns were on at any given time. The spreadsheet, which was filed in the Harris County Court, contains wind direction, wind speed, sulfur dioxide monitor readings, and kiln behavior information at 5-minute intervals from January 2017 through to June 2019. Grist analysed the data set from August 2018 after Oxbow ended its contract with PASE to July 2019. We found that winds blowing north, high-speed winds, and periods in which the winds were shifting toward the monitor predicted shutdowns. Oxbow's operations in March 2019 are particularly illustrative of their gaming the system. Even with just 2 kilns operational, the readings began ticking upward in the early hours of the 8th of March. That morning, Oxbow reduced the feed into 2 of the kilns by 2 tonnes per hour, but it seemed to make no difference. By lunchtime, Oxbow had registered 5-minute readings above 75 ppb, even though by then it was operating at just 25% of its average capacity. Nevertheless, ultimately the manoeuvring worked. The wind changed direction, and the readings dropped enough to lower the average that would determine compliance. When the state regulator eventually criticised and crunched the numbers, it reported that the highest 1-hour average was on March the 8th at 49.2 ppb, well below the federal threshold. In response to detailed questions about Oxbow's operations in March 2019 and Grist's analysis, Goldstein, the Oxbow spokesperson, said that the company sees no reason to relitigate our previous dispute with PASE for your purposes. The case is now closed, he said. Oxbow prevailed, and the entire file is a matter of public record. The answers to your questions can be found at the courthouse. Now go away. States have few incentives to intervene when allegations of gaming air monitors surface, especially when they know there's a good chance they'll lose because of corruption. After PASE executives dragged Oxbow into court, they met with TCEQ staff to explain how they believe the company was cheating the monitor, but nothing came of the meeting. TCEQ didn't investigate whether Oxbow was using this data inappropriately, which it clearly was. TCEQ was trying their best to get through the monitoring program and sort of sweep all of this under the rug, said Ray Doe, a PASE co-founder. Because here we are squealing about this, and instead of helping us and going in and really doing something about it, it just seemed like they were turning a blind eye. TCEQ continues to provide 5-minute monitoring data to Oxbow. The agency told Grist that the information is public and available to anyone who seeks it. It's just that no other company in Texas has. High monitor readings spelled trouble, not just for Oxbow, but the entire county, TCEQ, and the state. When the EPA finds that a county is in non-attainment of a certain ambient air quality standard, it requires the state to come up with a plan of action to cut pollution. The state environmental agency in turn typically requires polluting facilities in the entire county to reduce emissions, a costly and time-consuming endeavor. The process of developing such a plan is also expensive, taking up a significant amount of resources within the agency and racking up employee work hours. And if states don't come up with a sufficiently stringent plan, the EPA can take over and withhold federal funding, which they've done. on a number of occasions. However, in this case, clearly nothing has happened, and this very highly polluting power plant has been enabled and allowed to go on polluting its local citizens for decades. Louisiana has followed Texas's lead. The State Department of Environmental Quality did not respond to any specific questions about the access that it gave Oxbow to monitoring data, but internal emails available through court records between Oxbow employees confirmed that the company was able to access real-time monitoring data for its Louisiana plant as well, giving it the power to manipulate the results. During this time, the monitor did not register any sulfur dioxide levels above 75 parts per billion. And after 3 years of monitoring, the Louisiana Environmental Agency decommissioned the monitor, and Oxbow was found to be in compliance with the air quality standard. In Oklahoma, where Oxbow operates a calcining facility in Kremlin, roughly 100 miles north of Oklahoma City, regulators took a different tack. Initially, the Oklahoma Department of Environmental Quality, or OEQ, granted Oxbow the ability to access monitoring data directly. But a few months into the arrangement, the agency received an anonymous complaint that the company was using the data to change its operations on an hourly basis, such that it didn't set off the monitor. As a result, the agency ended Oxbow's access to the monitor. But by then, Oxbow knew how to manipulate the data. In order for DEQ to continue to certify to EPA that the data being gathered by the monitor is accurate and depicts the true sulfur dioxide levels that exist and will exist in the future, DEQ has determined that it can no longer provide 5-minute data to Oxbow via the CSV link. The then Air Quality Director wrote to Oxbow executives. A spokesperson for the agency told Grist that it never restored the company's access. No entity currently receives 5-minute data, said the spokesperson. At more than 150 feet tall, Oxbow's massive smokestacks stick out like beacons in the industrial corridor of Port Arthur. The yellowish-brown plume from the plant carries far and wide. When the cloud over it is low, the emissions stagnate, forming a sulfurous haze around the area. Sometimes the stench is so strong that Hilton Kelly, a Goldman Environmental Prize winner and local activist, can smell the sulfur when he steps out of his restaurant, Kelly's Kitchen, over 3 miles away. It smells like everybody is tarring their roof, Kelly said. It can make your throat itchy and your eyes burn. Exactly how far the pollution is carried depends on a number of factors, including the height and diameter of the stacks. However, it has been determined that coal power plants are killing people hundreds of miles away as the pollutants are carried by the wind for long distances. The taller a stack, the farther the plume drifts. Tall stacks, a 2011 Government Accountability Report found, increase the distance that pollutants travel and harm air quality in regions much further away. They do nothing, of course, to decrease the amount of pollution spewed into the air. Rather, taller stacks are a dodge to reduce the concentration of pollutants while doing nothing to decrease their magnitude. As a result, stack heights have been rising steadily over the years. The Port Arthur plant has had its stacks raised at least twice in the last few decades, once in 2006 before Oxbow's purchase of the plant, and again in 2018 when Oxbow found that the plant was violating sulfur dioxide limits. Holtham, the plant manager, notified TCEQ in September that Oxbow was replacing one of its stacks with a new structure that would be 20 feet taller. This was their new way to game the system, and it was almost 3 feet narrower than what it was before. Another strategy that forces emissions out and very, very high into the air. The change will provide additional loft of the plume and provide better dispersion from the kiln 4 stack, which will lower off property ambient concentrations of air contaminants, Holtham wrote. Oxbow stacks are now among the tallest in Texas, according to a Grist analysis of nearly 10,000 stacks at similar industrial operations. Replacing the stack had the desired effect on the experiments that Oxbow was running. In 2017 and early 2018, prior to replacing the stack, Kiln 4 exhibited a similar shutdown bias to the other kilns when the wind blew in the direction of the monitor. It was down 11%, of the time when the wind was blowing north versus 8% for other wind directions. But in 2019, after the stack was raised, any such correlation between wind direction and whether the kiln was on disappeared. Why? Because it no longer needed to be gamed. Now the stack was sending the pollution so high into the air that the monitor couldn't detect it. The overall wind direction distribution at the site didn't change, but after its replacement, Kiln 4 was virtually never shut down during periods when the wind blew in the direction of the monitor. Oxbow continues to argue against installing scrubbers in filings with state regulators. Over the last couple of years, states have been developing plans to reduce smog in national parks, and Oxbow's facilities have been flagged as a major contributor to regional haze in all 3 states that they operate in. The environmental agencies in Louisiana and Oklahoma required the company to conduct a 4-factor analysis, investigating different equipment that would reduce emissions, the cost of compliance, and any environmental impacts not related to air quality that may result. In Oklahoma, Oxbow claimed all 3 options that it explored were economically infeasible. In Louisiana, it claimed installing scrubbers would cost at least $88 million a year. And Texas's plan to reduce regional haze left Oxbow out, even though the Port Arthur plant releases more than 10,000 tons of sulfur dioxide a year, making it one of the largest polluters not only in the state, but also across the entirety of North America. Residents who live around the Oxbow facilities have been complaining about its pollution for years. Brandon Alberti, a pediatrician, first called the Louisiana Department of Environmental Quality, or LDEQ, about Oxbow in 2016. Alberti grew up in Baton Rouge and was used to seeing plumes spewing from smokestacks. But the plume from Oxbow's facility was very different. It had a hazy orangish brown color and was bigger than anything he'd ever seen from any other facility in the area. Driving home from work on Highway 61, Alberti saw the plume many times a week. I'm not like an environmentalist or anything like that, but it's just one of those things that clearly anybody can look at and say, this isn't right, he said. Between 2016 and 2018, Alberti called the government to report the plume multiple times. Each time, LDEQ, the government, checked the facility's monitoring records and told him the company was operating within the limits established in its permit, so everything was fine. Fed up, Alberti called local TV stations and newspapers. He called the EPA. He even tried to get his neighbor, an attorney, to see if there was a class action lawsuit that could be filed. Eventually, Alberti decided to look at the health data he had access to at his hospital. He found that ER visits and asthma rates in the zip codes in and around Oxbow were 3 times higher than the rest of the state. What a strange coincidence. Surely simply a coincidence. Armed with this information, he called the state epidemiologist's office and flagged the numbers for them. The state health agency took his complaint seriously and in 2019 published a report on the childhood asthma rate in East Baton Rouge. The report doesn't list Oxbow as the cause for higher asthma rates, but in a map of industrial facilities in the area, the company is named. Like Alberti, John Beard has been complaining about Oxbow's emissions in Texas for many years. Beard, a local activist and executive director of the Port Arthur Community Action Network, has testified in front of the state legislature and shown up at TCEQ permit hearings advocating for stricter emissions limits on Oxbow and other polluters. Most recently, Beard teamed up with an environmentalist group and a legal aid firm to petition the EPA to examine TCEQ's decisions to renew 2 permits. The EPA sided with the environmental groups last year in one of the cases and has directed TCEQ to re-examine Oxbow's record-keeping and air quality monitoring requirements. The groups have also filed a separate civil rights complaint against TCEQ over Oxbow's emissions with the EPA. Specifically, the complaint requests that the agency look into TCEQ tacitly approving Oxbow's dispersion techniques. Clearly, the government knows exactly what they're doing here and why they're doing it. It doesn't take a genius to just look into the air and see what's going on. Even a child could figure it out. By failing to investigate the company's practices, the government has been clearly complicit in these actions by David Koch. The complaint has since been accepted by the EPA and the agency is currently investigating. but nothing has happened yet, of course. Oxbow has not responded to any questions about whether it continues to run such experiments to this day. The data submitted to the court about the company's operations from January 2017 to June 2019 was shown in a deposition in November of 2019. Holtham, the plant manager, said the company was still running experiments based on wind direction and other parameters because we still have emissions. And we want to find out what process parameters to run in order to operate on a permanent basis. Clearly, he's just admitting the fact that they're still gaming the system. According to TCEQ, the agency continues to provide near real-time monitoring data directly to Oxbow so that they can continue to freely game the system. At the very least, Oxbow made operational changes based on wind direction from 2017 through half of 2019. If those experiments continue to this day, it raises serious questions about the validity of the monitoring data that the EPA relied on to certify them. In 2021, after examining air quality data from 2017 to 2020, the EPA declared that the county was in compliance with the sulfur dioxide standard. No worries, no problems. All those extra hospital visits, they don't matter. Nevertheless, over decades of advocacy on behalf of Port Arthur residents, Beard has come to identify Oxbow as a serial polluter. If you come to Port Arthur, walk the streets, and you ran into someone and you ask them, do you know of anyone who either had cancer, died from cancer, is currently undergoing treatment, or has been treated for cancer? You will not find a single person, whether child or adult of any age, who will tell you they don't know of anybody in the whole city getting cancer, he said. That's scary. In a city of 55,000 people, that is scary. Thank you for watching. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Bye-bye.